Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Victoria Pardini. I'm a program associate at the Kennan Institute. Thank you all for joining us today to discuss the book Replacing the Dead, The Politics of Reproduction in the Post-War Soviet Union, a new book by Mie Nakachi, which examines the Soviet Union's extreme pronatalist policy after World War II and its effects on women's lives, gender relations, and demography. Today's event is co-sponsored by the Wilson Center's History and Public Policy Program. I'm also pleased to share that Dr. Nakachi's book has recently received an honorable mention for the Help Prize for Best Book in Slavic, East European, and Eurasian Women's and Gender Studies by the Association of Women in Slavic Studies. And I'm also pleased to announce that we have a code for those of you joining who would like to purchase the book at the Oxford University Press website. You can use the code AAFLY G6 at checkout for a 30% discount. As a note of housekeeping today, if you have questions for our speakers, please use the Q&A feature in Zoom rather than raising your hand. We will be monitoring the Q&A throughout the event and we'll move to your questions following the presentation. So today I'll begin by introducing the speakers before giving them an opportunity to deliver some remarks before we turn to questions. I'll introduce both of you together. And then we'll go into conversation. So first, the book's author, of course, Dr. Mie Nakachi is a historian of 20th century Russia. She is a professor of global studies at Hakusei Gaon University and research associate at the Slavic Eurasian Research Center in Sapporo, Japan. Her specialty areas are population policy, gender, family, and reproductive health. In addition to authoring the subject of today's book talk, Replacing the Dead, Dr. Nakachi co-edited a comparative volume, Reproductive States, Global Perspectives on the Invention and Implementation of Population Policy. I'd also like to introduce today's discussant, Dr. Michele Rivkin-Fish. Dr. Rivkin-Fish is an associate professor of anthropology at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Her research focuses on reproductive politics and health in Soviet and post-Soviet Russia. And she is the author of Women's Health in Post-Soviet Russia, The Politics of Intervention, which won the Basker Prize for Outstanding Research on Gender and Health from the Society of Medical Anthropology, and is currently finishing a monograph on making Russia's abortion culture, family planning, and the struggle for a liberal biopolitics, which examines professional efforts to replace routine abortion use with contraceptive habits from the late Soviet 1950s to 2021 in Russia. So let's begin. Mie, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Victoria, for the introduction. Michelle, thank you so much for participating as a discussant today. I've been learning a lot from your work, and it's really exciting to have you here today. And thank you to those of you who are in the audience, despite the very early hour for many of you. It's a great pleasure to present my work. And let me begin. I'll be sharing a couple of images in the beginning of my presentation. On August 15, 2022, just a few months ago, the Russian President Vladimir Putin revived the title Mother Heroine. The first group of mothers with 10 or more children received their titles and cash awards in November 2022. Among the prize winners was Mie Nakachi, 44, the wife of the longtime Chechen leader Ramzan Kadyrov. She has given birth to 14 children. And now let me show you the image. Medini Kadyrova right here with the youngest son. So she has 9 boys and 5 girls. So this is one of today's Mother Heroine. It is well known that the honorary title Mother Heroine was originally introduced in the Soviet Union in 1944. And now I would like to show you the image of the 1944 version of Mother Heroine. This is a poster from 1944, Glory to the Mother Heroine. Here we have a mother with 10 children. Yes, so this is the image from 44. Less known is the fact that Nikita Khrushchev, party secretary of depopulated Ukraine, wrote the policy to address the skewed post-war sex ratio by encouraging out-of-wedlock births. Using a wide range of Soviet archival materials, my book, Replacing the Dead, examines Khrushchev's draft family policy, which he submitted from Kiev in spring 1944, in order to, quote, replace as quickly as possible the lost population to assure future demographic acceleration, end quote, was modified to become the law's final text. The book analyzes both short and long-term impacts of this pronatalist policy on gender relations, Soviet family, and demography. Today, I present two main lines of analysis from this book. First, come to an analysis of the 1944 family law, and second, the law's impact on women, family, and Soviet abortion policy. Then I will end with some conclusions. So first, analysis of the 1944 family law. At the end of World War II, Khrushchev witnessed with his own eyes the scale of demographic devastation brought by Nazi occupation and the war. There were only women and children left in Ukrainian villages. Indeed, according to a January 1944 demographic report to the Soviet leadership, the sex ratio in the USSR's rural areas liberated from German occupation stood at 28 versus 100, approximately 4 women for every man between the ages of 16 and 54. Khrushchev thought that the Soviet Union needed a comprehensive policy to accelerate the birth rate in order to recover the lost population as quickly as possible. His draft family law included new demographic ideas. One of them was the idea of making participation in the demographic recovery a civic responsibility for all citizens, men and women. The pre-war Soviet pronatalist policy that was introduced in 1936 tried to increase the birth rate by providing extra support for the most fertile mothers with 7 or more children. In contrast, Khrushchev's draft required all adult citizens to have 3 or more children. And I would like to show my last image now. So this is the last image. A poster that says, "The government's support helps me raise my children." Mothers with many children and single mothers, to register for government support, contact local executive committee, is what it says from 1947. And this became the book cover on my book. His draft also instituted a system of penalties for those who don't fulfill this civic responsibility in the form of so-called small family taxes. So not only the childless, but also those who have only 1 child would pay taxes. In this way, revenues from small family taxes would fund one-time payments and monthly support payments to fertile mothers, such as Mother Heroine, as well as the new state support for single mothers, to which I now turn. The most innovative and controversial aspect of the 1944 family law was its encouragement of out-of-wedlock births. The draft law does not clearly state this intention to increase out-of-wedlock births, but the attached informational note, Spravka, which described the thinking behind the legal language of the draft law, makes it unmistakably clear. So how could a family law encourage out-of-wedlock births? It was done through two types of amendments to the pre-war family law. First, it stipulated that there would only be legal recognition of registered marriage, which meant that common law marriages would no longer be recognized in the Soviet Union. Second, the post-war family law did not allow out-of-wedlock children to register the father's name in their birth certificates. Instead, a dash was placed in the section for the name of the father. The child had to use mother's family name and the patronymic of the mother's choice. The October Revolution had eliminated completely the category of out-of-wedlock children in order to ensure basic equalities among all children. But in 1944, the difference was revived, leaving the newly illegitimate without the same rights as children born in legal marriage. These legal changes also allowed the biological father not to take on any responsibilities, legal or economic, for out-of-wedlock children. This was a huge change from the pre-war policy, which gave fathers of all children, regardless of the type of marriage they were born in, the same legal and economic responsibilities. For example, they were required to pay a high level of child support, 25% of salary for one child, under the 1936 family law. If post-war single mothers could no longer ask for child support from biological fathers, how could they raise children alone? Importantly, Khrushchev's proposal introduced a new government support for single mothers, which would fully cover the level of child support required of pre-war biological fathers. In this way, the government would take over the biological father's financial responsibility. However, as Khrushchev's draft was reworked in Moscow, the Ministry of Finance tried to cut the project cost, and the level of single mother support was cut down significantly. In the final version of the 1944 family law, the amount of single mother support was two-thirds of the level Khrushchev's proposal had suggested. Moreover, 3 years later, in 1947, the level of single mother support was further reduced by half. Thus, after 1947, post-war single mothers received only 1/3 of the original level of support set in Khrushchev's proposal. Thus, post-war single mothers were expected to raise children in poverty and were expected to raise children who would not be allowed to carry their father's names. Aside from the changes made to the pre-war family law, in order to promote out-of-wedlock births, one key change was made to the law, which aimed at strengthening the family. That was the introduction of a very complex and costly procedure for divorce. By making divorce difficult, the policymakers had hoped that legally married couples would have 3 or more children in stable marriages, while unmarried women or widows would raise out-of-wedlock children. They did not seem to have thought about how these two types of families, one-parent and two-parent families, might affect each other. The 1944 family law impacted women and men differently. For men, marriage became potentially a very costly commitment, much harder to withdraw from than in previous years, while non-conjugal relationship for them became much less risky than before. For women, registered legal marriage became extremely important, both to protect their children from becoming fatherless and to protect their own reputation and material well-being. Non-conjugal relations became extremely risky for women. Yet, Soviet women generally wanted to become a mother. So at a time when so few men of reproductive ages were around, it was not easy to avoid single motherhood. Soviet women's struggle in this period is vividly depicted in a letter written by a woman to the Soviet leadership in 1945. I quote, I still want to have a child, but I don't have a husband. There's no one to marry. Men of my age are either at the front or married. Until now, I didn't particularly think about these questions, but now I must think. If I give birth to a child out of wedlock, I will not have the right to register him under the father's family name. I have to write down my own family name. It turns out that he'll be illegitimate, незаконно рожденный. Is either the child or I guilty that the war robbed me of my husband? The child will grow up and ask, who is my father? What should I tell him? Everyone will point their fingers at him and say, he's illegitimate. I can't agree with him. I consider that the right to receive child support can be curtailed, as long as the government has taken these responsibilities upon itself. But the right to carry a father's name must be upheld. After all, this morally destroys a woman, end quote. Despite women's raised voices, as the policymakers had hoped, the post-war period saw a high rate of out-of-wedlock births. However, the level never got as high as predicted by demographers. That is because demographers did not take into account the possibility of a rise in illegal abortions. In fact, the number of illegal abortions shot up dramatically in the post-war period. We will never know the real number, but we are talking about millions of prevented births every year. So who was undergoing abortions for what reasons? In 1920, the Soviet Union became the first country in the world to legalize abortion and provide abortion on demand. Between 1920 and 1936, the year when abortion was criminalized again, the Soviet Union developed an impressive system of studying abortions using mass case numbers. One of the large studies of abortion conducted in the mid-1930s, which involved over 5,000 cases, showed that the majority of women undergoing abortion was married. Also, it showed that the top reasons for undergoing abortion were economic conditions, and that family is already too large. Family problems constituted only 8%. We can compare them with the results of studies conducted after 1944. The Ministry of Health conducted studies of illegal abortions, first in the late 1940s and again in the early 1950s, in order to find out why illegal abortions are on the rise. In both studies, single women had a significant presence, about 30%, but the majority was legally married. This was similar to the pre-war study. The reasons for abortions were different. Women in the late 1940s and early 1950s named unstable relationship, which included reasons such as husband has another family, or husband is gone with his partner, as the main or second reason. By this point, Soviet doctors and legal specialists had been criticizing the 1944 family law for encouraging men's irresponsible behavior toward women and for creating legally and socially disadvantaged children. Therefore, Soviet doctors and medical bureaucrats quickly understood the link between the 1944 family law and unstable relationship, and that unstable relationship was the major cause for post-war abortions. Policymakers had hoped that two types of families, one-parent and two-parent families, would exist separately. But in reality, they were affecting each other's reproductive behaviors and decisions. With this result in mind, it became clear that increasing material support would not help resolve abortions. And particularly, female doctors and medical bureaucrats began to argue that if abortions are caused by both men and women, the Soviet Union's policy of punishing only women for abortions was wrong. A very important figure in developing this discourse was Maria Kovyrigina, the Soviet Union's first and only female Minister of Health. Before she became the minister in 1954, for a decade, she was the Deputy Minister of Health in charge of women's and children's health. Kovyrigina was responsible for these studies and knew the results very well. In addition, she had been receiving many letters from women from different parts of the Soviet Union who detailed their family circumstances and asked for special permission for legal abortions. Women wrote that they were not trying to escape from motherhood. In fact, most of them had multiple children already. But the most recent pregnancy came at a very difficult time. If they could not get a permission, they would find illegal means, but they did not wish to leave their children orphans, as actually happened to around 4,000 Soviet women every year, killed by botched abortions. Some of them wrote that Soviet doctors should help women rather than driving them into illegal abortions. Kovyrigina marked yes in the margins. At a 1955 meeting, top Soviet doctors and medical bureaucrats gathered to discuss abortion policy with Kovyrigina as the chair. She clearly stated, quote, "Here, some reasonable ideas should be formulated that perhaps lift the ban against the individual that degrades a woman by controlling her intimate life," end quote. Kovyrigina also said, quote, "A woman should be given the right to decide herself," end quote. Based on this very idea of women's right to decide herself, Kovyrigina took the proposal to legalize abortion to the Central Committee, and it was quickly adopted during the brief political, social, and cultural loosening after Stalin's death. Thus, the Soviet Union's 1955 re-legalization was based on the idea of women's right to abortion. This makes the Soviet Union the first country in the world to legalize abortion based on the idea of women's reproductive right. However, this fact was unknown for a very long time because Kovyrigina completely hid the concept of women's right in her official proposal to end criminalization. This term was nowhere in the language of the law either. Yet, re-legalization was achieved, and Soviet women regained access to clinical abortion. Abortion remained legal until the end of the Soviet Union and remains legal in Russia today, although the access has been narrowing gradually. So now I would like to conclude. This history shows that the pronatalist policy that undermined the well-being of mothers and children was not successful. There's no evidence that shows that the policy raised the post-war birth rate significantly. But there's much evidence that the policy increased suffering among many, especially women and children. But women did not simply submit to being victims of the policy. Instead, they resorted to illegal abortions when the circumstances were less than ideal, even at the risk of death. Women will act on their own reproductive decisions. I hope this lesson can be remembered by Putin as well as other policymakers around the world, including those in the United States. Thank you for your attention and looking forward to comments and questions from Michele, Victoria, and the audience.
Thank you so much, Mie. So we'll turn now to Dr. Rivkin-Fish for just a response and some questions and comments.
Okay.
Please.
Thank you so much. I'm really honored to offer these comments on this excellent and important book. And I want to thank Victoria and Lenny for making this event possible. With Replacing the Dead, Mie Nakachi has made a tremendously important contribution to the history of public health, gender politics, pronatalism, and abortion in the Soviet Union. This book also offers a significant case study with a study of comparative welfare systems and reproductive politics. My comments today will outline the first of these major contributions to Soviet history. Because of shortage of time, I can't go into the other many important things for comparative welfare systems. And then I will raise just a few questions that arose as I considered how these findings impact my own thinking about efforts to promote contraception as a replacement for abortion during the later Soviet and post-Soviet decades. As Mie shows in this finely grained history, Soviet public health experts and the top leadership confronted the immense losses of men in World War II with grave concern. For in 1944, in rural regions of the country, as Mie reminds us, there was an average of 28 men per 100 women. Maintaining a large and even growing population was of great concern for Soviet leaders, and they recognized that even just replacing the losses would not be possible given the current sex imbalance. Mie demonstrates that the solution devised by the top Soviet elites was to establish the new family law of 1944, which incentivized men to sire as many children as possible by exempting them from any responsibility for a child fathered outside of marriage. To institutionalize this policy bureaucratically, the law resurrected the category of out-of-wedlock children, which, as she reminded us now, the Bolsheviks had actually annulled as a bourgeois idea. But the 1944 law now legally categorized a child born outside of marriage as having no biological father. The state promised to provide single mothers with support to raise these children, and it further aimed to increase births by dissuading women who found themselves pregnant from seeking abortions, which of course were both illegal and unsafe. Notably, Khrushchev's initial draft of the family law proposed providing government support to single mothers in the amount equal to what they would have received in child support had they been married. And the proposal also would levy penalties for anyone who shamed unmarried pregnant women or unmarried mothers, thereby recognizing that there's a need to prevent the social costs of out-of-wedlock childbearing. But instead of Khrushchev's proposal, the final law actually reduced the amount of government support for single mothers and did not intervene to promote respect for single motherhood. Mie observes the irony of Soviet political leaders' strategy for increasing the population. They promoted sex without responsibility for men while reneging on the promise to support child rearing for women, essentially relegating all responsibility for sex and its outcomes to them, to women. Women's burdens were immense. The policy of so-called emancipation meant they were working full-time in the labor force, but childcare services were inadequate. There were deficits in housing, consumer goods, and foodstuffs. Women coped with these circumstances by limiting their childbearing, and with abortion banned since 1936, they did so by resorting to unsafe, illegal abortions, which in turn led to high maternal mortality, orphan children, and cases of secondary sterility that left many women who did survive their underground abortions childless. Two major contributions of Mie's book emerge in her findings about how these policies came about and how they were presented to the public. First is her insight that the top leadership considered, but ultimately rejected, the idea of actually providing genuine support to women. They understood women's economic plight and the cultural costs that they would pay for unwed motherhood, but nonetheless refused to help them. Second, Mie reveals how state leaders cynically manipulated their public presentation of the law, rhetorically celebrating the socialist state's extensive care for mothers and children, while in internal documents among themselves, they framed the law as a strategy for increasing the birth rate alone. Another significant contribution of Mie's book is the account she provides of how, amidst this harrowing situation, the public health minister, Maria Kovrígina, strategized to get a reversal of the abortion ban, which was leading to so many women's deaths and infertility. This particular story that Mie tells is immensely important. We learn how the head of the Central Statistical Administration, V.N. Starovsky, sought to hide both the causal role of the family law's gender inequalities and the impact of famine on suppressing the birth rate, which of course, had he done, would have implicated the Soviet state in the demographic losses. Instead, Starovsky blamed women. He celebrated the 1944 family law and then asserted that women's use of abortion was itself responsible for the fact that the birth rate wasn't rising. Now, in the book, what I picked up on in Mie's discussion of Kovrígina's strategy was that she had been herself planning to push for a reversal of the family law. But when Starovsky reaffirmed its value and celebrated it, Kovrígina shifted her tactics. Mie suggests that Kovrígina understood that arguing the need to legalize abortion because of economic deprivation would not be persuasive, as top leaders would remind everyone that, well, such hardship is temporary, and as the wartime suffering faded, socialism would flourish and women would be able to raise many children. Aware of that, Kovrígina carefully and tactically made the cause of abortion into an issue that the state could less easily address, the challenges of male-female relationships. And Mie reveals that in order to get the abortion ban reversed and prevent women from dying from unsafe abortions, Kovrígina argued that women have a, quote, right to decide the issue of childbearing for themselves. I'd like to share with you the importance of these findings for my own research, which picks up where Mie's leaves off. I trace the rise of the demographic crisis from the late 1960s until 2022, and demonstrate how the unwavering and narrow approach to pronatalism shaped public health efforts to promote contraceptives in place of routine abortion. I'm indebted to Mie's finding regarding historical roots of the assumption that abortion causes a low birth rate and that reducing abortions would increase the birth rate. These enduring misconceptions have been central to policymakers' ambivalence toward promoting contraceptives and the practice of many doctors and psychologists to push pregnant women seeking abortions to change their minds and give birth instead of terminating. This is something that she shows comes back to Starovsky, and it is continuing even at the present. Indeed, since contraceptive advocates began establishing family planning clinics in the early to mid 1990s, nationalists have accused them of trying to suppress fertility by convincing women to prevent conceptions and overall to avoid childbearing. In their view, the view of nationalists, the alternative is for pregnant women to give birth, and the state should cajole, incentivize, and even coerce them by restricting abortion. Mie's findings allow me to recognize the roots of this phenomenon in Starovsky's cynical propaganda, and also in the state's refusal to support single mothers, even while claiming to do so and ignoring women's difficulties. I just need to clarify that the idea is that contraceptives would replace abortion and not have any effect on the birth rate. People who have abortions would prevent the unwanted pregnancy, and the birth rate would not go up or down with contraceptive use. But because the pronatalist ideology is that you should convince pregnant women who want abortions to give birth instead, the idea is that reducing abortions would immediately or would automatically increase the birth rate rather than just replace unwanted conceptions with only wanted ones through contraceptive use. Finally, I'd like to raise a question I have regarding Mie's argument that Kovrygiina established the concept that women have a reproductive right. And here's where I find some room for debate. Mie is careful to show how exactly Kovrygiina introduced the idea that women should have the space for deciding on childbearing themselves, without endorsing an unlimited right to reproductive autonomy, or even suggesting that abortion was a legitimate act. Indeed, Kovrygiina was trying to open the space for women to have some degree of childbearing self-determination, but also sustaining the explicit pronatalist government stance. And Mie argues the following. At the August 23rd meeting, Kovrygiina revealed her support for the legalization option, arguing that, quote, although giving birth is a woman's social function, it is nonetheless her personal affair as well. We should not transform women into a being that only gives birth, end of quote of Kovrygiina. However, as Mie continues, the minister was also of the opinion that some kind of limit was necessary since abortion could be harmful to women's health. She considered that there should be a way to reconcile these positions. And Mie continues on page 179, in the actual law legalizing abortion on November 23rd, 1955, it was not a woman's right that was provided, but the state allowing the, quote, possibility, unquote, of deciding the question of motherhood by herself. Thus, paternalistic language replaced the ideas of right and justice. The idea that criminalization had been an attack on women's private lives was also absent in the law. The language of women's reproductive rights would never appear in public under socialism, end of quote. So, Mie, I believe that we have an interesting dilemma here that you try, and I think you succeed largely in weaving a very careful and nuanced discussion. But it seems to me that you ultimately come down on the argument that Kovrygiina did establish the idea of women's reproductive right, however, let's say limited. I'm not entirely persuaded that Kovrygiina's move, important as it was, could be characterized as establishing the idea of a woman's reproductive right, given the continuing struggle that happened decades later to even establish that reproductive rights are something people recognize. But I am happy to hear your response, and I thank everyone for their attention.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Mie, would you like to respond to that last question or any of the comments before we move to audience questions?
Yes, thank you so much, Michelle, for your careful reading and sharing, your thoughts in general. There's just too many things that we can talk about. But on the last point of, whether or not Kovrygiina succeeded in really establishing, this idea of women's right, reproductive right, this is definitely something that I also wondered about for a long time. But in the end, I think the way she really talked about women's right, she uses the term, the right, was very, very significant. And I understood that she couldn't really present that term if she really wanted re-legalization to pass with her male colleagues. She knew that that language will not be accepted. So I think this was her very, political move when she eliminated all of that and presented the proposal in such a way, you know, with the kind of language that's been used before. The idea that the women's cultural level has gone up already, so they are ready to make their own decisions. That kind of language was used in the 1930s already. And so, you know, my understanding is that it was her political, you know, decision. She really wanted this to pass, and she chose to do it. Yes, and that choice was probably wrong in the long run, but you know, now we think about it. But I think at the time that was perhaps important, so that she was able to make abortion available. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And then just adding on to that, I thought that another compelling part of that conversation and the relegalization of abortion was the tie-in with family planning, and the conversation that it wasn't a matter of if a woman would become pregnant, but just when. So putting it as a question of agency of she'll have children eventually, but this abortion option allows her to space out her children. It's not a matter of deciding to not have children entirely. But so anyway, as you I might be able to tell, I have so many questions, and I found this such a deep and interesting book. But let me first turn to some audience questions that came through, and I'll ask my questions if there's additional time. A reminder to our audience that we ask that you use the Zoom Q&A feature to send any questions that you might have for our panelists today. So one question that came in was from Michael Keyes, a fellow at the Wilson Center. He asks, was the reduction in Soviet government support to single mothers essentially designed to spur them to get married?
Sorry, I'm not sure if I understood the question correctly. Could you say it again, maybe?
Sure. So it's a question of, as the support kind of in the varying proposals that came out for single mother aid, was that with an ulterior motive of encouraging marriage in addition to birth, or what was the rationale behind decreasing the aid to single mothers?
Increasing the aid to single mothers after the war. Actually, the amount of aid was decreased, not increased. Yes, I don't know if that was clear. If it was, I didn't make it very clear. I'm sorry, but the amount of aid that Khrushchev thought was appropriate was cut down by 1947 to 1/3. So actually, I would say that amount was reduced instead of, yes, increased.
And what was the rationale in decreasing that aid from the different proposals?
Okay, just to cut down the cost of the entire project, which included increasing aid to mothers and bigger group of mothers than previous years. So project needed a lot of huge budget. So the Ministry of Finance was trying to cut down on the entire cost. And they cut down everything. They tried, but single mother's aid was one of them, that was cut down together with other. So there was no political explanation of any kind, as I could see in the documents. Mm-hmm. And nobody tried to protect particularly to, maintain a certain level for single mothers.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. So we have a question about sources, which I would love also just generally if you speak on the sources that you use, because it was a really fascinating conversation or a fascinating combination rather of archival material and interviews and things like that. But Alexandra Potter writes, I'm currently writing my dissertation on this topic. I was wondering where the best places to find primary source material on this issue is, and what you would recommend for someone researching this.
Yes, thank you. Right now, of course, not everybody can go to the archives, but if you're lucky enough to get there, some of the important materials I used are from the Ministry of Health archive. The statistical materials are from Edgar A. I also use, party archives for, leadership, the reports to leadership and so forth. Moscow City Archive also had very good materials. Some of them had lichny fonts, the personal files of different people, including Kovriginas. I also went to, regional archives, Saratov in particular for court cases. They, at least when I was there, made these, court case materials more, gave me access to look at them. In Moscow archives, it was harder, and so forth. Yes, those are some of the key places I was able to find materials.
Great, thank you. So a few questions that kind of touch on the contemporary as well. Grigory Berzonsky writes, as it was said that the Soviet Union was the first country to legalize abortion, and as abortion has since then become legal in more and more countries, has the Soviet Union or contemporary Russia ever sought credit or boasted about being progressive in their family planning laws? So an interesting question, and also maybe a moment to consider the increasingly conservative family planning legislation in Russia today.
Have they ever gotten any credit for being progressive? I think among, some of the progressive people that had been noticed, perhaps, but not as widely known as it should have been. And I think it's because of Cold War politics for a long time, to really appreciate anything that the Soviet Union did might not have been a good thing for people to know, perhaps in some parts of the world. Yes. Was there a second part of the question? Sorry. Or did I answer the question more than?
I think that was the gist of the question, Michelle. I see that you're.
Yeah, I would like to suggest a different way to think about the Soviet policy. Because contraceptives were not made available and people were not given options to avoid abortion, it only seems from the outside to have been a very progressive policy. It was a very difficult experience to undergo the abortion. There was often no anesthesia. Women were often punitively treated, told that they were rejecting their maternal responsibility, at least after, I'm talking now after abortion was made legal in the 50s and later. So it was not an experience of empowerment for women. It was certainly better than not having access to legal abortion, but it would be hard to have characterized it as a purely progressive and empowering experience, given that the conditions were really horrific. And I think that that's a challenge for us to grapple with, because we're so used to, in the West, thinking of accessible legal abortion as an unmitigated good, which it is in comparison with illegal abortion, but just the access to it alone is not necessarily as empowering as it needs to be.
Michelle, do you think the situation might have been different before 1960? Before the West started having real effective modern contraception? Yeah,
I agree with your point that it was certainly a better situation, although even discussions about, say, promoting withdrawal there are ways, even without modern technologies, to more carefully prevent unwanted pregnancy. And there was never, I mean, the Soviet Union didn't want to talk about that, neither did the West really, because it was considered not appropriate or obscene, or because it would prevent, so some thought it would prevent men's pleasure. So there was a lot of patriarchal kind of bias that went into, and communist morality that went into not talking about alternatives for preventing unwanted pregnancy. But yes, I mean, it was certainly an improvement to have legal abortion rather than to have to go underground for it.
Great, thank you both. Another question that came up from Michael Keyes that I also want to add on to a bit. He asks if the question of a labor shortage was a consideration in re-legalizing abortion. Yeah, I know that in your book you also touch on this, persisting issue of the double burden in the Soviet Union for women, where they have these labor expectations and then they also have to go home and do the very real labor of working in a home, which was not an expectation usually set for Soviet men, and the gender differences that abound there are everywhere in your book as well. Were there any sources that you saw or any conversations internally that might have indicated this was a consideration in re-legalization?
Oh, absolutely. Yes. Among the doctors' discussions, they talk about how women are working. They're a very essential part of economy. And so that's one of the reasons that they need to, be able to control their pregnancies. And yes, so labor shortage and the need for female labor certainly affected this discussion.
I also thought a really interesting component of your book was discussion of surveillance, and both abortion surveillance and also surveillance of women who opted in to this government aid program, these single mothers, which included, I believe you mentioned, sort of checking in to make sure that they weren't also in a common law marriage and getting aid and also sharing some sort of income. Can you talk a little bit about how that surveillance network worked? And was it something that was kind of prevalent throughout the Soviet Union? Was it more prevalent to have kind of an institutionalized network of surveillance in larger cities, or was it kind of ubiquitous for women who were in the government aid programs?
Yes, thank you. Of course, it was a very important part of receiving or being eligible for government aid for single mothers. You had to prove that you're indeed living without a man. And I believe it was institutionalized. And so, regardless of where you were living, you will get regular visits from the militia, typically. And that was something that single mothers didn't want. Many of them, when they learned that would be involved, they didn't want to apply for the government support because it's too humiliating for them.
Thank you. So I have another question that I'm also going to turn into my question as well. So Ann Carson asks about how ubiquitous abortion became as the dominant method of birth control, for example, in the 90s. And she asks why the availability of abortion became so widespread. I'm also curious to add to this question. So your book really touches a lot on the issue of stigmatization, and stigmatization specifically in relation to fatherless children. I think that you mentioned 3 or 4 different ways of even calling a child fatherless, the psychological ramifications of that for the mother and for the child. So clearly there's stigmatization when it comes to single motherhood. Did that exist in the same way? I mean, coming from the United States, where there's a large stigmatization around abortion, was that a similar issue, or was it known as kind of an everyday part of life and of family planning?
So the first part of the question was, how did abortion become dominant method of fertility control? So I think I'm being asked why there was no contraception. Yes, probably. So contraception, the development of contraception became illegal in 1936 first, and it remained so more or less until 55, when abortion was re-legalized. But after that, definitely there was an effort to develop effective contraception. But that didn't really go much of anywhere. There was a huge effort on the part of medical professionals, but that wasn't connected with the production system. Soviet Union was had an economy, centralized economy. So if resources were not allocated into producing contraceptives, then of course you can't really see them in the market. But another story is that in 1974, hormonal contraception was practically banned. And so there seemed to have been some kind of political decision not to really promote. And this is something that Michele probably knows better than I do, because I don't really know the background to this decision. But yes, so contraception, modern contraception was never produced enough or made available, which is why abortion became the dominant form of fertility control. The stigmatization question, in the Soviet Union, I think it is probably slightly different, but stigmatization was particularly about a child being born out of wedlock. And this is a very cultural question, which I actually don't have a real answer. This is one of the big questions I have. I still, remains to be a question. Russian women seem to have stronger desire to be a mother than women in most other cultures. And even today, there's a very low rate of childlessness. And they seem to have this idea that the child should be born in marriage. And yes, I can't really say where it comes from, but there was definitely still stigmatization after World War II because of that, because there were so many children who were born in families where there was no man living.
Can I jump in?
Yes, Michele.
Yes, I wanted to also comment on this important question. So the 1974 decision to ban oral contraceptives is another example of how there was one rhetoric that was presented to the public and another internal set of concerns that were kept secret and only among the politicians. So the claim that was made and the sort of justification for not making oral contraceptives widely available was that they were harmful for women's health. And this is definitely true for the first generation of oral contraceptives that were created and made available in 1960. They had very high levels of hormones, and women did suffer from bad side effects, including some deaths. In the United States and Britain, however, the continuing work of R&D led to lower dose oral contraceptives, and also various systems of control, so that there was some limit on who could access them based on to try to prevent bad side effects. But the Soviet Ministry of Health continued to tell everyone publicly that hormones, as they were called, were terrible and would be harmful to women and should not be available. And that persisted as an understanding, as a perception of oral contraceptives through the mid-1990s, and was something that the family planning advocates, once they were able to do their work, really worked to change people's minds about it. It took a while. But among themselves, there's some evidence that the public health officials who knew what was going on with oral contraceptives actually were afraid that if they became very widespread, that the birth rate would be suppressed, and that there's also some evidence that they were afraid that if oral contraceptives started being spread throughout, circulating throughout the public without medical control, that they would become taken by people that maybe had contraindications, and that it would also lead to deaths. But the birth rate concern continued to play a role in suppressing that. And I just want to add one more thing, if I may. The person asked, why did abortion availability become so widespread even later in the 90s? And actually in the late 1980s and throughout the 1990s, the availability of abortion was expanded repeatedly because the public health officials were worried that with such economic catastrophe that was happening then, that if abortion wasn't available legally, women would get abortions illegally and suffer from maternal mortality. So they continually opened up more and more criteria according to which women could access abortion, even second trimester abortions. But they didn't, it was really the non-governmental sphere and foreign international family planning organizations that pushed for contraceptives. Yeltsin's government did a little bit, but as soon as the nationalists started having this moral panic about contraceptives affecting the birth rate negatively, the government clamped down and said, we're not really comfortable with spreading contraceptions.
Thank you both, and thank you, Michelle, for that additional context. We're already past the hour, but I'll have one more question just as a means of both wrapping up and just a last kind of broad question. So tying into a question posed by Eleanor Hardy, asking about the lessons that can be learned in contemporary policy regarding abortion and women's reproductive health. She asks what questions or what lessons can be learned from these post-war policies and debates. And I also want to add on to ask again, as a way of conclusion, what shadow do these policies continue to cast today, also in Russia, in their pronatalist and reproductive policies?
Well, the biggest lesson, and not probably surprising lesson, that we learned from this policy and the result of the policy, the long-term results as well as short-term result, is that if you don't think about the welfare of women and children, women, mothers and children, you cannot really promote higher birth rate. It's just so contradictory as an idea. You have to fully support mothers if you really want to see a rise in birth rate. And the Russian government, has not been able to see that. That seems to be very consistent. And so that's, one of the lessons I would say is important. And what we see, as a result of these policies is really still high rate of abortion, and also, in Russia in particular. Of course, since 1990s, the level of abortion has gone down significantly in Russia, but Russia still has one of the highest abortion rates in the world. And fertility control in general, I think, is not very well developed. So that would be one of the legacies. of the post-war policies. Thank you.
Okay. Well, with that, I wanted to thank you both for joining us today for just a really excellent and rich and fascinating conversation. I know we could have talked for much longer on the topic. Thank you again to the Wilson Center's History and Public Policy Program for co-sponsoring today's book talk. And also thank you to Oxford University Press. I know that there was a chat just now with that detail, but a reminder that you can order and purchase the book on their website for a 30% discount using the code AAFLYG6. Again, the book is Replacing the Dead. It was just an absolutely rich and excellent and kind and compassionate, also I should mention, view on the issue and on the policy. Please visit our website if you'd like to stay up to date with upcoming events and publications, as well as our podcasts, Ken and X and the Russia File. You can find our latest analysis of events in Ukraine, Russia, and the region on our Russia File, Focus Ukraine, and in other word blogs. Thank you all again for joining us, and we will see you next time.